In this lesson, we're going to be creating a school of fish using the animated fish that we created in our last lesson as a particle, and we'll also be using the particular particle plugin. Okay, so to make this effect work properly, one thing I want to go ahead and change right now is the length of the amount of times that this is looping. So right now we have it looping 25 times. I want it to loop the entire comp's duration. So that's just going to make it easier to work with. So come up here, go to your green fish swim AVI, right click that, go to interpret footage main, and instead of 25 times I'm going to turn this all the way up to 300. So this just makes it a little bit easier to use. Now we need to add a new solid for our particles. So come up here to layer, go to new solid, and I'm just going to choose a dark green color that's kind of similar to the color of my fish for that effect to work with, just so this color over here I kind of know those are my swimming fish particles. Then come over here to your effects and presets and type in particular. Now, if you don't have particular, you won't be able to do this exactly the same with any of the particle systems that come with After Effects because you can't use an animated particle with those. Particular is one of the only ones that will give you that flexibility. So go ahead and select that particular plugin and drop it onto your green solid. Then I'm going to just solo that green solid layer and we'll toggle off that transparency. So now we're just starting, this is all we're looking at. Okay, so what I want to do is create a burst of particles that comes on and then goes away. And I really only need this to last about 4 to 5 seconds. So what I'm going to do is just scrub forward to about that time, about 5 seconds almost. And we'll set a marker on our timeline. So I don't want to set it right on the layer. I'm just going to do it right on the timeline. So you can click kind of off to the side, right in between there to deselect, then hit the asterisk key on your number pad. And let's zoom in a little bit. And I'm going to come over here to the very beginning of the layer and go up to my emitter property. Now to create this burst, I'm going to set this at 0 at the beginning of my comp. So go ahead and type in a 0 and keyframe that by turning on the stopwatch. To take a look at that keyframe, you can hit the U key to bring that up. And then we want to move forward 1 frame until at this point we want it to be emitting 100 particles. So type in 100. There you go. So now we have a nice little burst of particles. And then right before we get to this marker, I want to set another keyframe at 100. So you can just click that add keyframe. Then we'll move forward 1 frame again. So just hit page down and then we'll take that back down to 0. So now we have kind of a burst of particles that pops on and then goes away. So that's basically representing the way we want those fish to look. Now there's some other things that I want to change in here also. So what I want to do is have those fish kind of come in from the left and swim over our title, and that's going to be what kind of exits the title off of the scene. So first of all, I need to move my emitter over. So you can just click right there in the middle and start dragging that to the side. We also want to change our emitter type from point to box, and that's just going to give us a little bit more realistic looking particles. You can hold down the space bar and pull this over to the side. And I also don't want to have any velocity. I only want the fish to be moved by what we're going to make it look like they're swimming, which is going to be with the wind property. So we'll change that a little bit later, but now that we're in emitter, just go ahead and turn the velocity down to 0. So you can see now those particles are just kind of in a little square like that. We'll scoot this over to the side, and you can see that nothing, you can't really see anything change if we just scrub through here, which that's actually what we want. Now what I want to happen is I want the fish to be almost off of screen by about right here at 4 seconds. So I'm going to come down and we're going to go into our physics, and the air property is what we're going to be changing, and I want it to be the wind X because wind is going to be moving it one way or the other, and I want it to be X because I want it to be side to side. So I'm going to turn that wind up, and let's just pull this over here so we can see. Turn that wind up some more so they're all the way across, and you can see that that's kind of how that works. Now, we need the wind to be strong enough so that by the time we get to these keyframes, the wind has completely pushed those particles all the way over to the side. So let's turn this way up, and we'll go ahead and set a keyframe here. Then we're going to go back to the beginning, and we don't want the wind to be quite so great at the beginning because we don't want them to move so fast. So I'm going to turn the wind back down a little bit lower at the beginning, and then they'll get faster as they continue to move. So kind of like this. Now, one other issue we have is that these fish are kind of all really close together, so I'm going to make them a little bit further apart by changing that emitter size Y, so we can just pull that up. And you can also change the emitter size Z to push them back in Z space a bit. But you just want to be careful that none of them pop on. Doesn't look like they are. It looks like they're all still far to the left. So we're getting kind of a burst of fish just like this. Now, if you feel like this is too many fish and they're not ending soon enough, you can always pull these keys back, and then they'll start ending a little bit sooner right around where that actual marker was. So that might help you out a little bit just to do it that way. Now, this is looking pretty good, but notice that we have a little bit of an issue just with these look very static. So maybe we want to add a little bit of spin to these particles. So I'm going to come down here, and where you see the spin frequency, you can turn that up a little bit. And also the spin amplitude. And those properties are going to just add a little bit more variation to make it look more like these are fish that are swimming through here. So once you're happy with just the way that you've keyed this, you can go ahead and tell it that now we don't want these particles anymore. We want it to be our fish, which is that animated layer. So I'm going to take the fish actually and drag it all the way down to the bottom of the stack because I don't want to see this fish. I want to have it just use this fish as its target. So I'm going to go ahead and right here, we'll go ahead and solo that as well, just so I can see what the fish looks like. And then we'll come back up here, grab our dark green solid, and to change it into this fish, there's two things we have to change. So come down here where you see particle, we'll drop that down, and right now the particle type is a sphere. So we want to change that to a sprite. And that's going to make all of them go away because we haven't told it what we want that sprite to be. And the way you do that is by going to your texture property. So go ahead and drop that down. And where it says layer none, choose the green fish swim. So now we have lots of tiny little fish. So these are way too small. We're going to crank up that size so we can see more fish. Just like that. So this was looking pretty good, but they look really close to all the same size, even though we added a little bit of change in that Z position. Now that's still going to give us some nice parallax, but if you want to have more just difference in the size, you can always change that size % random. Just turn that up, and then you may want to turn the size overall down just so they're not quite so many. So now we have a nice little school of fish that all kind of come over like this. But they still look a little bit strange because they're all moving in exact unison. So we need to change our time sampling. Right now it's sampling from the current time, so we need to change that so it's more random. We're going to choose random loop. So what will happen is that if it can just pick any random place all along our timeline, and then once it gets to the end of the timeline, it'll go back to the beginning. So choose random loop, and you can see now there's a little bit of an offset. Okay, so to watch this through, we can do a RAM preview. I'm just going to unsolo that layer and unsolo this layer. And maybe we don't want to look at the words just yet, so I can go ahead and let's only solo the pale solid and our particles. And we probably also want to turn on motion blur for these fish too, so we can turn on that switch. And you see that does change their transparency a little bit, so that's helpful just to know how fast they're actually going. And let's scrub forward to right about where we know they end, and we'll hit the N key. And then I'll just hit the 0 key on my number pad to start a RAM preview, and we can watch those fish swim through. And I think it's looking pretty good as it is right now. We're getting a little bit of an issue a couple of times I saw there with the transparency of our fish, so we can go back in and fix that if we need to. Probably just tweak that Z property a little bit for the Z emitter.
Let's talk about the state of our reefs.
I think that looks pretty good. Now, the spin amplitude is definitely too much. That's why they look kind of jumpy. So we can just come back in here and let's just move back to this position here. And we'll just turn that down right in there. And maybe have the X emitter, or excuse me, the Z emitter size a little bit smaller. So we'll still have some parallax, but not quite as much. Let's watch a rain preview of that. Looks like that's changing that spin amplitude took care of some of the transparency popping we had in some of those fish there at the front.
Let's talk about the state of our reefs in overview.
So this is looking really good. The only thing I'm noticing is that some of the fish do appear to pop on just slightly. So kind of as we come in here, you'll notice that fish pops on instead of swims on. So one way to fix that is to turn your X emitter size all the way down to 0. So there's no chance of them coming on a little bit later. And if you still have trouble, you can always come over here and actually move that X emitter size back so you're sure that they're further back when they first originate. And so sometimes having that Z emitter size, they're actually further back, and then you can see them just over here. So they're further back from that emitter. Let's see if that fixed it. It's just a little bit of a guessing game to really get the particles perfect. Now this still, that looks a lot better. I feel like I'm not really seeing any popping on there at the beginning if I just scrub that really slowly. And I'll just finish that rain preview out. Let's just make sure that they make it all the way to the end and that we don't need to tweak any of those end properties.
Let's talk about the state of our reefs in overview. Let's talk about the state of our reefs.
Now that looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with the way that that looks. One thing that I might want to change just to make those fish go faster at the end is to actually take a look at that wind property that we looked at earlier. So go ahead and select your layer. Let's just hit the U key again just to make sure we don't have any keyframes on that. Looks like we do have them, but it got pulled so far forward it was a little bit harder to tell. So we'll just pull that back to where these keys are. And now let's watch that. And you might be able to tell that they get a little bit faster, a little bit sooner. So they start swimming faster right about there. And you could even pull that back further if you wanted to. So that's just going to continue to increase their speed over time, and then they'll kind of top out. But the faster that they get to that point that they're going faster, the faster they'll exit. So just to make sure that they get completely off of the screen in time. Now, I don't want those fish to actually come on until he says an overview. So I'm just going to scrub that really quickly, holding control. So right when he's saying an overview is when I want that to come on. So I'm going to just take that layer and we'll pull that forward so it begins right there. So right about here when he finishes saying the over 1 million part is where we want that to end. So let's just pull these frames back even farther. Have this a little bit sooner still. Just like this. So our fish are almost completely gone by that point. And you can see that's actually a lot less fish too, because they're not being emitted for as long. And you'll notice that I'm getting a little bit of a pop of those fish right there. And that's just something that sometimes can happen whenever you start really tweaking these particle emitter properties, whenever you move your layer around a lot and move the keyframes around a lot, it can really start to kind of cause some problems. So one of the things that you can do to avoid that is to figure out exactly where you want those properties to be and then just set it up there in the first place. It seems like it has a tendency to get more glitchy the more changes you make. So sometimes it can take a couple of tries to get it perfect. But besides that pop, which I'm just going to quickly fix in between our lessons, this is looking really good. I'm really happy with the way that that fish school looks, and I think it's a little bit better that there's not quite so many fish. So in this lesson we learned how to create a school of fish using particular, and in our next lesson we're going to take that original fish that we had that we're using as our particle and animate him to kind of swim behind everybody else to look like he's just a little bit of a straggler. He's not quite with the school and he just is trying to catch up with everybody. So that just kind of adds a little bit of interest to the story instead of just having all those fish together. Just a very small little detail really helps to bring everything to life. So we'll learn how to do that in our next lesson.